In 1945, the South China Sea functioned less as a single battlefield than as a connected operating space linking the Philippines, the China coast, French Indochina, Borneo, and the approaches to Malaya and Singapore. Its geography mattered operationally. Merchant traffic and naval movements were channeled through the Luzon Strait and Bashi Channel to the north, across routes paralleling the Indochina coastline, and toward choke points leading to the Malacca and Sunda Straits. Control of these lanes shaped the movement of fuel, food, raw materials, and reinforcements between Japan's home islands and the territories it occupied or garrisoned. By early 1945, Japan's shipping situation had become a central constraint on strategy. A U.S. Navy operational summary of the Pacific Submarine Campaign describes Japanese cargo carrying capacity as about 6 million tons at the start of the war. 6 million tons reduced to less than 3 million tons by the end of 1944, despite shipbuilding efforts, and to less than 2 million tons by August 1945, with only 312,000 tons described as fit to haul cargo. That same source gives an assessed total of 8,897,000 tons of Japanese merchant tonnage sunk, ships over 500 gross tons, or put out of action for the duration, attributing 4,861,300 tons to submarines, 54.64%, 1,452,900 tons to U.S. Navy carrier aircraft, 16.33%, and 910,100 tons to U.S. Army Air, 10.23%, with the remainder divided among other causes. In practical terms, the South China Sea became one of the remaining corridors where Japan attempted to move oil products from the southern resource areas and to sustain isolated garrisons, while Allied forces increasingly treated that corridor as a target set rather than neutral sea space. Allied operational reach into the region expanded sharply in late 1944 and early 1945. U.S. forces held major forward anchorages and logistics nodes in the Western Pacific and, after landings in the Philippines, gained airfield networks that supported long-range reconnaissance and strikes toward the China coast and Indochina. Within this wider framework, the U.S. Third Fleet planned carrier operations west of Luzon in connection with the Luzon campaign, using fast carrier task groups to attack airfields, shipping concentrations, and port infrastructure that supported Japanese movement through the South China Sea. Japanese command arrangements in the South China Sea reflected its position between theaters. The region included naval and air units tasked with convoy escort, local air defense, and the protection of key ports and staging areas, while higher-level Army authority in Southeast Asia and adjacent areas shaped priorities for holding territory and sustaining communications. In the January 1945 carrier raid that would become a focal episode of the South China Sea fighting, U.S. command is commonly summarized as Admiral William F. Halsey, Third Fleet, with Vice Admiral John S. McCain, Sr. directing the fast carrier force, while Japanese responsibility in the broader area is associated with Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi in Southeast Asia. The civilian and political landscape along the seas rim also influenced operations. Coastal cities and river ports in Indochina and southern China were not only population centers, but also nodes for warehousing, repair, and coastal shipping that substituted for longer ocean routes as losses mounted. In French Indochina, the relationship between Japanese forces and the existing French colonial administration deteriorated into open conflict in March 1945, when Japanese forces moved to dismantle French authority and restructure local regimes under Japanese direction, creating further administrative disruption in areas already exposed to blockade and air attack. Within this context, the phrase battle over the South China Sea in 1945 refers to an intensifying contest over movement, Allied efforts to deny Japan the use of sea lanes and ports, and Japanese efforts to keep enough shipping and air cover functioning to move fuel and supplies, and to defend critical coastal bases. A key precondition was that, by January 1945, U.S. carrier forces were prepared to operate inside the South China Sea itself. The South China Sea Raid, designated Operation Gratitude, ran from 10 to 20 January 1945 and targeted Japanese shipping, warships, and aircraft to support the Luzon landings, with later assessments commonly listing about 300,000 tons of shipping lost in the broader early January window, and U.S. aircraft losses recorded separately as combat and operational categories. On 30th December 1944, the United States Third Fleet sortied from Ulithi with the fast carrier force designated Task Force 38 under Vice Admiral John S. McCain, Sr., operating under Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. The intention, as summarized in later U.S. reporting, was to enter the South China Sea and sink enemy shipping encountered, with particular attention to any Japanese naval forces believed to be in the Cam Ranh Bay area. The fleet's entry was an operational threshold. During the night of 9th to 10th January, the main body transited the Bashi Channel at the northern end of the Luzon Strait, while a logistics group moved via the Balintong Channel. The passage itself mattered because it tested two competing realities: U.S. confidence and surprise, and Japanese reliance on reconnaissance and warning networks stretched across multiple coastlines. In the U.S. account, highlighted by a declassified historical summary, Task Force 38 achieved complete surprise. An official report cited there recorded that U.S. aircraft downed 3 aircraft without a corresponding Japanese radio reaction being detected, with Japanese communications interception occurring only after initial air combat. From the Japanese perspective, the opening phase was defined by uncertainty and priorities divided across theaters. Naval escorts and local air units in Indochina and along the China coast were tasked with convoy protection and port defense, while major fleet units were not positioned to contest a carrier force in the central South China Sea. Later, U.S. reporting noted that the expected fleet concentration in the Cam Ranh Bay area was not present. For Japanese commanders, the practical question became how quickly dispersed escorts, shore-based aircraft, and warning systems could respond once the presence of carriers inside the South China Sea was confirmed. Weather and refueling shaped decisions on both sides. U.S. task groups had to sustain high-speed maneuvering while conducting underway replenishment in heavy seas typical of the season, because destroyers and screening ships determined how long the carriers could remain inside the sea without exposing themselves during predictable refueling windows. Japanese defenders, facing intermittent communications and limited ability to mass aircraft, confronted a different timing problem. Localized warnings could arrive too late to concentrate fighters or to disperse convoys already committed to coastal routes. By 11th January, the Third Fleet was moving toward the Indochina coast, with the next day's objectives focused on locating shipping concentrations and any warships, then striking quickly before a coordinated response could form. For people on the coastline, this opening phase registered as an escalation of risk rather than a discrete battle. Ports, anchorages, and coastal convoys now sat within reach of carrier aircraft operating from the sea, while the administrative structures in French Indochina and occupied coastal China faced the immediate question of how to protect infrastructure and populations during sudden air attack warnings that might arrive minutes, not hours, before impact. For Allied planners in early 1945, the South China Sea was a means to an end. Reduce Japan's ability to move fuel and supplies, limit the reinforcement of garrisons from Indochina to the China coast, and keep Japanese air and naval forces away from the Luzon beachhead. The operational logic linked several layers at once. At the tactical level, fast carriers could reach ports and shipping concentrations beyond the range of many land-based fighters. At the theater level, cutting coastal shipping helped isolate armies that still held territory, but were increasingly dependent on irregular resupply by sea. At the strategic level, sustained pressure on merchant shipping and port infrastructure was expected to shorten the time Japan could keep large formations, supplied with aviation fuel, bunker oil, and food. The Third Fleet Carrier raid into the South China Sea in January 1945 was planned as a high-speed penetration, supported by a large screen and a dedicated logistics train. Carrier task groups relied on cyclic flight operations, combat air patrol to reduce the risk of sudden air attack, search aircraft to locate shipping, then strike packages coordinated across multiple carriers to saturate defenses at a chosen time. Planning emphasized time on station. The ability to remain inside the sea depended less on the carriers themselves than on destroyers, fuel oilers, and ammunition ships that enabled continuous screening and replenishment. This meant refueling plans were operational decisions, not purely logistical ones, because predictable replenishment patterns created windows of vulnerability and influenced which coastal areas could be struck on which days. Intelligence estimates shaped the initial objectives. U.S. planners expected that a concentration of Japanese naval units might be found at major Indochina anchorages, including Cam Ranh Bay, and that heavy shipping traffic would still be moving along the coast and between Hainan, Saigon, Hong Kong, and smaller ports. These expectations were partly correct on merchant traffic, but less certain on major fleet units. A recurring problem in planning was that shipping could disperse rapidly once attacks began, and local defenders could shift aircraft between airfields with short notice. As a result, strike planning prioritized targets that could not easily move: oil storage, dock facilities, repair yards, and airfield infrastructure. Japanese goals in the same period were constrained by fuel, pilot availability, and the condition of the escort force. The basic requirement was to keep some flow of oil products and strategic materials moving north from the southern resource areas and to sustain garrisons whose land communications were disrupted or vulnerable. That goal forced a balancing act. Concentrating escorts and aircraft could protect one convoy or one port, but left other routes exposed. Dispersing escorts increased coverage, but reduced the ability to defeat a massed carrier strike. Japanese convoy planning therefore tended to favor coastal routing, night movement, and use of smaller vessels in mixed formations, including Kaiboken escorts, minesweepers, and remaining destroyers where available. Air defense increasingly relied on shore-based fighters and bombers operating under fuel limits, while local commanders used camouflage, dispersal of ships within anchorages, and rapid unloading to reduce exposure time. Both sides also planned for psychological and political effects, but in different ways. U.S. carrier forces treated visible results, burning ships in anchorages, wrecked airfields, and disrupted port activity, as indicators of operational success that could be reported quickly and used to justify continued deep raids. Japanese authorities and local administrations sought to preserve order in port cities and prevent panic that could halt labor and transport. For civilians along the Indochina and China coasts, planning decisions translated into practical changes: tightened port controls, blackouts, relocation of stores away from waterfronts, and emergency preparations for air raid warnings that often provided limited time. Miscalculations were built into the situation. Allied planners risked overestimating the value of a single raid if shipping simply shifted to smaller craft, inland waterways, or hidden anchorages. Japanese planners risked assuming that coastal dispersion and limited fighter response could keep ports functional when repeated strikes could degrade repair capacity and fuel distribution, even if individual convoys survived. The next phase of the campaign would test which planning assumptions held once sustained carrier aviation entered the South China Sea and began striking the systems that kept movement possible. On 11th January 1945, as the Third Fleet moved inside the South China Sea, U.S. planning shifted from penetration to target acquisition. Before dawn on 12th January, carrier aircraft were launched on wide search patterns toward the Indochina coast and major anchorages, including the Cam Ranh Bay area, where U.S. estimates expected possible Japanese heavy units. No capital ships were located in the search window, and attention moved to convoys and port traffic that could be attacked within the range limits of carrier aircraft, and the time available before weather and refueling requirements forced a course change. The first large-scale engagements began shortly after sunrise on the 12th of January. Around 7:31, aircraft from multiple carrier task groups began coordinated strikes along the coast, between central and southern Indochina. Japanese units in the area were primarily organized for convoy escort and coastal defense, not for repelling a concentrated carrier attack. The initial U.S. method combined fighter sweeps and combat air patrol with strike elements aimed at ships identified by reconnaissance aircraft, then expanded to secondary targets such as docks, oil storage, and airfields, when shipping targets were exhausted or dispersed. One of the earliest convoy battles occurred off Quai Nhuon in central Indochina. A convoy of 10 ships escorted by elements identified in U.S. reporting as the 101st Flotilla was attacked in successive waves. Reported losses in that engagement included 4 loaded oil tankers and 3 freighters, along with the Japanese light cruiser Kishi and several small escort vessels. The same day, additional convoys were struck near Cape Padaran and near Cape Saint-Jacques in southern Indochina, with repeated reports of tankers and freighters sunk or driven ashore, and multiple small escorts lost in the process. At Saigon and nearby approaches, carrier aircraft attacked shipping in the river and port area, as well as oil and dock installations. Some vessels were hit while alongside or while attempting to move into shallower waters. Others were damaged and later abandoned or beached. Along the same coastal sector, strikes also hit transport links supporting the ports, including rail infrastructure and bridges, reflecting an operational priority to reduce the ability to clear cargo, repair ships, and shift supplies inland after the raid. A surface strike group detached from the carrier formation was intended to exploit any opportunity to engage ships attempting to flee or to intercept forces moving from major anchorages. In the event, no major surface action developed on January 12th, largely because targets were either destroyed by air attack, dispersed into coastal waters, or were not present where intelligence had suggested. The day remained an air-sea battle shaped by reconnaissance, rapid strike sequencing, and the limited ability of local Japanese escorts to concentrate firepower against multiple incoming attack groups. By the end of 12 January, U.S. after-action summaries credited the raids off Indochina with 46 Japanese ships sunk, including 33 merchant vessels totaling 142,285 tons and 13 warships. Listed warship losses included Kishi, 2 destroyers, 7 coast defense vessels, CD-17, CD-19, CD-23, CD-35, CD-43, CD-51, Chiburi, a patrol boat, number 103, a minesweeper, Ottawa Maru, and a military transport, T-140. These figures captured the immediate result of the opening engagements. Japan's coastal convoy system and port shipping in the South China Sea could be hit simultaneously across multiple points when a carrier force operated inside the sea. After the 12th January strikes off Indochina, the Third Fleet faced an immediate operational dilemma: how to keep a fast carrier force inside the South China Sea long enough to exploit its advantage, while destroyer fuel states and deteriorating weather narrowed the margin for error. The planned destroyer refueling on January 10th had already been disrupted, and heavy seas continued to complicate underway replenishment. On the evening of January 12th, the fleet reversed course and began steering northeast to avoid a typhoon and reduce exposure to Japanese search efforts, while still trying to refuel screening ships in conditions that made close formation fueling hazardous. On 13th January, refueling remained the central constraint. All destroyers were eventually refueled, but the process consumed time and imposed predictable patterns on fleet movement. That same day, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King directed the Third Fleet to remain positioned to intercept any enemy forces approaching the Lingayen Gulf area from either north or south. In relaying this, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz also authorized strikes toward the Hong Kong area if higher-value targets could not be located elsewhere, effectively widening the operational decision space from convoy hunting to attacks on major logistics hubs. By 14th January, the crisis shifted from destroyer endurance to the fleet's broader fuel posture. With weather still poor, major ships continued to top off, but the effort drew heavily on the accompanying logistics group stocks. U.S. reporting summarized the outcome in percentage terms rather than full replenishment. Major warships were eventually brought to at least 60% of fuel capacity, and the logistics group later separated to meet additional tankers. The result was a trade-off. The fleet preserved striking power, but its replenishment margin tightened, raising the cost of any delay, battle damage, or extended flight operations. The decision point came early on January 15th. At 3 a.m., Vice Admiral John S. McCain Sr. recommended canceling planned strikes and turning south due to weather. Admiral William F. Halsey Jr. chose to continue north and execute the attack plan, ordering reconnaissance not only over Formosa, but also toward Amoy, Hainan, Hong Kong, the Pescadores, and Swatow, reflecting the continuing intelligence priority of locating the Ise-class battleships thought to be operating in the region. Strikes began at 7:30, while the fleet was reported about 255 miles east-southeast of Hong Kong and 170 miles southwest of Formosa, combining fighter sweeps against airfields and raids against shipping. Weather and anti-aircraft fire limited results compared to the Indochina Day, but U.S. accounts list the destroyer Hadakazi and landing ship T-14 sunk at Takao, the destroyer Tsuga sunk near Mako, and attacks on Pratas Island facilities. U.S. pilots claimed 16 Japanese aircraft shot down and 18 destroyed on the ground. U.S. losses for the day were reported as 12 aircraft to combat and accidents. On 16th January, the operation escalated into a higher-risk phase defined by concentrated defenses and civilian exposure around a dense urban port. Hong Kong, a Japanese-held logistics base and harbor complex already subject to USAAF raids from China, became the main objective. U.S. carrier aviation struck in two large waves, 138 aircraft in the morning and 158 in the afternoon. Reported results included 5 large tankers and an Imperial Japanese Navy oiler sunk, damage to other shipping, severe damage to Kai Tak Airport, with aircraft on the ground destroyed, and extensive hits on the Kowloon and Taikoo docks. Opportunistic attacks also hit rail traffic and other targets along the Kowloon-Canton corridor. Japanese defenders emphasized anti-aircraft fire rather than large fighter engagements, and U.S. accounts described the garrison's anti-aircraft tactics as unusually effective for the raiders. The cost was correspondingly high. U.S. losses that day were reported as 22 aircraft shot down in combat and 27 lost in accidents, while Japanese claims and U.S. claims differed on air-to-air results. For civilians and detainees, the crisis of the 16th of January was measured less in tonnage than in proximity to targets. The village of Hung Hom, near the dock area, was heavily bombed, and accounts describe hundreds of civilians killed or wounded. Stanley Internment Camp was struck by a bomb that killed 14 Allied civilian internees, an event later documented in camp records as the worst single accidental loss of life inside the camp during the war. In nearby Macau, a neutral Portuguese colony operating under Japanese pressure and influence, U.S. aircraft attacked a stockpile of aviation fuel at the Naval Aviation Center after Allied intelligence indicated it was intended for Japanese use, illustrating how the raids could extend beyond formal belligerent territory when logistics were interlinked. By mid-January, the pattern of escalation was clear. The carrier force could reach and strike multiple nodes, shipping, airfields, docks, fuel storage, but sustaining that reach required continuous replenishment under adverse weather. While Japanese defenders increasingly relied on concentrated anti-aircraft defenses and dispersal measures rather than fleet intervention, the same mechanics that made the raid militarily effective, speed, surprise, massed air power, also increased the likelihood of collateral damage in crowded port environments, turning operational success into a parallel humanitarian and political crisis that neither side could ignore as the campaign progressed. By 15th January 1945, the Third Fleet was operating under a constraint that shaped every tactical choice. Even if the carriers reversed course to avoid poor weather, they would still remain within range of enemy airfields on Formosa and the China coast. In the early hours, at 3 a.m., the fast carrier commander recommended canceling the day's strikes due to adverse conditions. Admiral Halsey reviewed the weather and tactical situation and ordered operations to proceed, prioritizing continued pressure on land-based air and attacks on shipping concentrations. The 15th January plan combined a main effort against Formosa with searches and secondary missions directed toward the Pescadores, Amoy, Swatow, Hong Kong, and the Hainan area. That day illustrates how peak tempo could be reached even when visibility and seas were limiting. Reconnaissance widened to locate moving shipping and to detect airfield activity, while small strike packages were used where targets appeared briefly. One documented example was the late afternoon night plane attack against a Japanese weather station and radio installations on Pratas Island, carried out when broader strikes were being constrained by conditions. On 16th January, the operation reached its highest concentration of targets in a single day. Hong Kong, Canton, and Hainan were struck in force as part of the effort to disrupt port throughput, coastal logistics, and nearby airfields supporting convoy protection. In the Hong Kong area alone, U.S. Navy carrier aircraft conducted 2 large raids, 138 aircraft in the morning and 158 in the afternoon, with missions spanning shipping in the harbor, port facilities, Kai Tak Airfield, and rail traffic on the Kowloon-Canton Railway. From the U.S. perspective, the operational goal at Hong Kong was not occupation, but immediate denial, sink or disable tankers and cargo ships, damage docks and repair capacity, and reduce the usefulness of local airfields. Reported shipping results included 5 large tankers and an Imperial Japanese Navy oiler sunk in the harbor area. The tankers were identified as part of convoy HI-87, which had been diverted in an attempt to avoid the carrier force. Kai Tak Airport was reported heavily damaged, with aircraft on the ground destroyed in the raid window. Japanese defenders around Hong Kong could not match carrier aviation with comparable numbers of interceptors over the target area, so resistance relied heavily on anti-aircraft fire. U.S. accounts described the garrison's anti-aircraft tactics as more effective than previously encountered in this operation, with particular consequences for low-level attack profiles. The BF Avenger torpedo bombers were tasked against shipping, but reports note that torpedoes were set to run too deep, limiting effect even when aircraft reached release parameters. The same day included operations whose political status differed from standard combat targets. Neutral Portuguese Macau was struck, with the stated objective being a stockpile of aviation fuel at the Macau Naval Aviation Center that Allied sources believed was intended for Japanese use. The incident became a diplomatic issue after the raid, and later research has examined the planning and culpability surrounding the decision and target identification. For civilians, the peak was measured by proximity to the port and transport network. In the Hong Kong area, the village of Hung Hom near the docks was hit, with accounts describing hundreds of civilians killed or wounded. Stanley Internment Camp was also struck, killing 14 Allied civilian internees, a loss later studied as a case of friendly fire within the broader raid. Attrition peaked alongside intensity. U.S. reporting for January 16th lists 22 aircraft shot down in combat and 27 lost in accidents. Japanese claims for the Hong Kong defense included 10 aircraft shot down over the colony, while U.S. pilots reported limited air-to-air destruction in the target area compared with the scale of the raid. Operationally, 15 to 16 January marked the moment when a fast carrier force demonstrated that it could strike multiple major nodes, shipping, docks, airfields, rail links, across the northern South China Sea, rim in rapid sequence, while Japanese defenders showed that concentrated anti-aircraft defense and dispersed logistics could raise aircraft losses even when they could not prevent attacks outright. After the 12 to 16 January sequence, both sides adjusted quickly because the carrier force had demonstrated reach but also revealed vulnerabilities. Operations depended on destroyer fuel, flight deck tempo, and safe recovery in poor weather, while defenders could not stop strikes but could raise the cost through concentrated anti-aircraft fire and by forcing pilots into difficult attack profiles. For U.S. carrier commanders, the immediate adaptation was procedural. Combat air patrols were kept heavier during launch and recovery windows to reduce the risk of surprise attacks, while search patterns were widened and staggered to prevent gaps when the fleet changed course for refueling or weather avoidance. Strike leaders increasingly emphasized target selection that matched the conditions. When low-level attacks into dense harbor defenses produced higher losses, planners relied more on higher-altitude bombing against fixed port infrastructure, rail links, and airfield runways, while reserving torpedo or glide bomb approaches for targets where approach lanes and defenses were less concentrated. The large number of non-combat losses recorded on the 16th of January, alongside combat shootdowns, reinforced another adaptation: stricter recovery discipline in marginal visibility, divert procedures for damaged aircraft, and conservative launch decisions when winds and deck motion reduced safety margins. Ordnance choices were also adapted. Aircraft had carried torpedoes for ship-killing missions, but experience at Hong Kong showed that weapon settings and harbor depth could reduce effectiveness. That pushed commanders to combine bomb loads and strafing rockets against smaller vessels, and to treat oil storage, dock cranes, warehouses, and repair shops as priority targets because they could not disperse at sea speed. The aim shifted from counting ships to reducing throughput. Ships damaged at anchor, docks cratered, and fuel handling slowed. Japanese adaptation was shaped by scarcity and geography. Local naval escorts and port commands could not concentrate a fleet response, so defense became a problem of time and concealment. Convoys that still moved tended to route closer to shore, use darkness and poor weather, and rely on smaller craft, including coastal freighters, lighters, and barges that could be hidden in river mouths and shallow inlets where aircraft had less room to maneuver, and where a damaged ship could be beached quickly. Ports and anchorages increased dispersal inside harbors, moving ships away from obvious clusters and using camouflage nets, smoke, and strict blackout procedures to complicate visual acquisition during dawn and dusk approaches. Anti-aircraft defense became the main tool for resistance. The Hong Kong raids showed that a concentrated belt of guns around docks and airfields could impose losses even when fighter interception was limited. This did not prevent damage to shipping and infrastructure, but it influenced Allied behavior by discouraging repeated low-altitude runs and by increasing the probability that a damaged aircraft would be lost later during recovery. For Japanese commanders, the practical measure of success was often not stopping a raid, but preserving enough trained crews, escorts, and repair capacity to keep some flow of supplies moving after the strike. Civilian adaptation occurred in parallel, under occupation administrations and local authorities with limited resources. After repeated attacks on dock areas and rail approaches, port labor was reorganized into shorter shifts and emergency unloading routines to reduce the time a ship remained alongside. Hospitals, fire brigades, and civil defense teams expanded first response procedures, clearing debris to reopen access roads, controlling fuel fires near storage depots, and moving the most vulnerable populations away from waterfront districts when warnings were received. In Hong Kong, the 16th January raid produced casualties near the docks and within the Stanley internment camp, reinforcing the reality that even when targets were military or logistical, confined civilian spaces could still be struck by error or dispersion. By late January, the contest over the South China Sea had become a contest over adaptation cycles. Carrier aviation could return on short notice, but it had to manage weather, fuel, and pilot fatigue. Defenders could not match massed carrier strikes, but they could alter patterns of movement, harden key nodes, and raise aircraft losses through anti-aircraft concentration and concealment. The next phase would depend on whether Allied forces could sustain repeated pressure while maintaining operational safety, and whether Japanese logistics could continue to function under a pattern of sudden, high-intensity disruptions. The turning point in the 1945 struggle over the South China Sea was not a single fleet action, but the shift from episodic disruption to sustained denial. The January 10th to 20th carrier penetration demonstrated that fast carriers could enter the sea, strike ports and convoys along the Indochina and China coasts, and withdraw through the Luzon Strait without needing to seize territory in the region. After that proof, the operational question changed. Could Allied forces turn the South China Sea into a space where Japanese shipping could not move in economically useful volumes, not just a space where it could be surprised on a particular day? For the United States and its allies, the key change was basing and persistence. As the Luzon campaign progressed, airfields in the Philippines increasingly supported regular reconnaissance and anti-shipping strikes by land-based aircraft. This meant that the pressure on shipping was no longer tied to the presence of a carrier force inside the sea. Carrier raids remained possible, but the day-to-day attrition could be applied by patrol aircraft, medium bombers, and fighters operating from captured or expanded airfields, coordinated with submarine patrol areas positioned to intercept traffic moving between Indochina, Hainan, Hong Kong, and Formosa, and through the approaches to the Luzon Strait. From the Japanese perspective, the turning point was recognized through logistics decisions rather than declarations. The immediate adaptations after the January raids, dispersal within anchorages, tighter blackout procedures, routing closer to shore, and increased reliance on smaller craft, reduced the probability of a single catastrophic convoy loss, but also reduced transport efficiency. Smaller vessels carried fewer tons per voyage, required more crews per ton delivered, and were still vulnerable to air attack when forced to pass predictable coastal choke points. At the same time, the escort problem tightened. A convoy system requires not only hulls, but escorts, fuel for escorts, trained crews, and repair capacity after damage. As losses accumulated, each of these inputs became harder to replace at the pace required. This produced an operational cascade. Japanese planners increasingly treated large, deep-water movements through the central South China Sea as a high-risk choice rather than routine practice. Fuel and lubricant shipments became a priority, but also the most constrained cargo, because tankers and oilers were identifiable targets, and because the loss of a single tanker could remove both the cargo and the ship from the system. To compensate, more supplies were stockpiled where they could be landed and cached, even if that meant concentrating resources in areas that might later be isolated. The consequence was a mismatch between where fuel and materials existed and where they were needed. Garrisons could hold territory, but their mobility and air operations depended on deliveries that became irregular. For coastal societies, the turning point was felt as a tightening of time and choice. Ports along Indochina and the China coast remained active, but under growing constraints: fewer arrivals, more reliance on night work, faster unloading under air raid risk, and repeated damage to docks, warehouses, and rail connections. Economic activity shifted toward short-haul coastal movement and inland substitution where possible, while populations near waterfronts faced recurring displacement pressure during alerts. In places where administrative authority was already unstable, the disruption of imports and coastal distribution contributed to shortages and intensified competition over transport priority between military needs, industrial needs, and basic civilian supply. By mid-1945, the contest had shifted decisively from identifying a battle day to measuring system performance over weeks. How many tons could be moved, how often convoys could sail, how quickly damaged ports could be repaired, and how many flight hours defenders could sustain. The South China Sea ceased to function as a reliable strategic corridor, and became a space where movement itself was the exception that required special planning and accepted risk. The next stage would be defined by what happens when a maritime region is not formally occupied, yet effectively controlled through air and submarine pressure, forcing withdrawals, isolations, and last resort improvisation on all sides. The January 1945 carrier penetration into the South China Sea ended as a planned withdrawal rather than a forced retreat. On 20 January, after completing strikes against shipping, ports, and airfields from Indochina to the Hong Kong area, the fast carrier force exited back through the Luzon Strait, returning to the operational priority of supporting the Philippines campaign. The immediate military outcome was asymmetric in form. The United States did not occupy coastal objectives from the sea, while Japan did not lose a major fleet battle. Yet the shipping system that connected Japan's remaining southern holdings to the home islands absorbed losses that could not be quickly replaced. In the weeks that followed, combat in the South China Sea shifted from concentrated carrier raids to a pattern of sustained interdiction. Submarines, land-based aircraft operating from the Philippines, and later wider Allied air coverage continued to target coastal traffic, port approaches, and remaining tanker movements. Japanese shipping adapted by reducing convoy size, shifting towards smaller coastal craft, and increasing night movement. But these measures reduced tonnage delivered per voyage and increased the number of sailings required to move the same cargo. As a result, many garrisons around the sea rim remained in place but operated under tightening supply limits, especially for fuel, aviation gasoline, and spare parts. The South China Sea increasingly functioned as a hazardous transit zone rather than a reliable corridor. The operational consequences for Japanese forces were cumulative, where units had depended on the coastal shipping for rice, ammunition, and POL products. Shortages translated into reduced training, fewer vehicle movements, and, for air units, fewer sorties. In some areas, ships damaged in raids were abandoned in shallow waters, or kept immobile as floating storage because repair capacity and fuel for towing were limited. Port infrastructure struck earlier in 1945 also reduced throughput. Even when cargo existed locally, damaged cranes, wrecked dock faces, and disrupted rail links slowed distribution inland. For local administrations, the same constraints affected civilians, since military and civilian supply drew from overlapping transport networks. The decisive end of combat operations came with Japan's acceptance of surrender terms in August 1945. Following the public announcement of acceptance on 15 August 1945 and the formal signing on 2 September 1945, Japanese forces across the South China Sea region received orders to cease offensive operations, remain in place, and surrender to designated Allied authorities. In practical terms, this ended the organized attempt to run convoys under air threat. The maritime priority shifted rapidly from interdiction to control and recovery, securing ports, preventing scuttling, clearing mines, re-establishing navigation aids, and organizing the movement of prisoners of war, civilian internees, and displaced persons. Occupation and handover proceeded unevenly around the sea. In Hong Kong, British forces returned in late August 1945, and a formal surrender ceremony followed in mid-September, marking the administrative transition. Across Indochina, responsibility for accepting Japanese surrenders and restoring order was divided among Allied commands, creating overlapping zones of control and accelerating political change on shore. the sea lanes themselves reopened gradually because wrecks, damaged harbors, and mine threats limited immediate recovery even after fighting stopped. By late 1945, the South China Sea had moved from a contested military operating area to a post-war transport problem. The end of combat did not instantly restore commerce. Ships were scarce, fuel stocks were uneven, port labor systems had been disrupted, and coastal populations faced shortages. What had been a battle over movement became a struggle to rebuild movement under new political conditions shaped by surrender, occupation, and the rapid reordering of authority along the sea's rim. In historical terms, the battle over the South China Sea in 1945 is best understood as a campaign of denial rather than a single decisive engagement. Its defining feature was the attempt to control movement. Japan sought to keep sea lines functioning, to move fuel and supplies, and to sustain coastal bases. The United States and its allies sought to make that movement unreliable, increasingly costly, and finally uneconomical. The outcome was not measured by a captured harbor, but by the shrinking ability to transport tonnage across a maritime space that linked multiple occupied territories to Japan's industrial core. The January 1945 penetration by a fast carrier force into the South China Sea showed a specific operational possibility. Carriers could enter through the Luzon Strait, strike coastal convoys, ports, and airfields along Indochina and the China coast, and withdraw without attempting permanent sea control by surface patrol. That raid is often remembered for concentrated results over several days, including the documented sinking of large numbers of merchant ships and escorts off Indochina on the 12th of January, and high aircraft losses in the Hong Kong raid on the 16th of January. In operational history, it represents a mature form of carrier warfare, a logistics-supported deep strike aimed at the maritime system rather than at a battle fleet. At the same time, the campaign's strategic effect cannot be assigned to carriers alone. Submarine warfare and land-based air power had already reduced Japanese merchant capacity before 1945 and continued to do so afterward. The South China Sea episode matters because it illustrates the convergence of these methods: submarines attacking routes and choke points, land-based aircraft extending daily coverage, and carriers delivering concentrated blows when targets and timing favored a deep penetration. The resulting pressure changed Japanese logistics behavior, pushing movement towards smaller craft, coastal routing, night sailings, and dispersal within anchorages, methods that reduced exposure but also reduced throughput and increased the manpower cost per ton delivered. The human and political legacy along the sea's rim was complex and uneven. In port cities such as Hong Kong, raids against shipping and docks accelerated the disruption of wartime logistics, but also produced civilian casualties and accidental losses among internees, demonstrating how attacks on military and economic infrastructure in dense urban environments could not be fully separated from civilian harm. Along the Indochina coast, damage to ports and coastal shipping affected military supply and civilian distribution simultaneously, because both drew on the same waterfront labor: warehouses, rail links, and coastal craft. These disruptions interacted with the broader breakdown of wartime administration in 1945, including the collapse of imperial control structures and the rapid reordering of authority after Japan's surrender. In naval history, the South China Sea fighting contributed to post-war understanding of sea denial and the vulnerability of maritime economies to sustained interdiction. It highlighted several practical lessons: the decisive importance of logistics ships and destroyer endurance for carrier operations, the ability of concentrated anti-aircraft defenses to impose aircraft attrition even without winning air superiority, the limits of torpedo attack in shallow or confined harbors, and the value of targeting repair capacity, fuel handling, and port throughput, rather than focusing only on ship sinkings. These lessons fed into later doctrine about integrating reconnaissance, strike aviation, submarines, and blockade strategy. There are also enduring debates in the historiography. One concerns measurement, whether success should be assessed by ships sunk, by tonnage denied over time, or by the reduction in the operational mobility of Japanese forces. Another concerns attribution, How much of the late war collapse in Japanese logistics should be credited to carrier raids versus the cumulative effects of submarines and land-based air power? A third concerns terminology. Battle suggests a bounded event, while the evidence points to an extended struggle over routes, schedules, and capacity that connected the South China Sea to the Philippines, the China coast, and the southern resource areas. Ultimately, the South China Sea in 1945 mattered because it was one of the last major spaces where Japan's remaining imperial structure depended on maritime movement to function. When that movement became sporadic and risky, the military consequences followed predictably. Fewer supplies delivered, fewer aircraft sorties sustained, less flexibility in moving troops and material, and more isolated garrisons holding territory without reliable support. After August 1945, the same sea lanes became corridors for surrender, repatriation, relief, and reconstruction under new political realities shaped by occupation, decolonization, and the emergence of post-war conflicts across East and Southeast Asia.